Hey, I have a question. Why did Lucifer and a third of the angels rebel against God? After all, we're talking about perfect, sinless beings living in the presence of the Creator who were fully aware of their master's capabilities. Yet for some reason, they decided it was a good idea to box with God. Does this story make sense to anyone? Look, back in ancient times during the 1980s, Mike Tyson was the most feared fighter on the planet. People used to joke about how much money it would take for them to step into the ring with Iron Mike. Would a person do it for $20,000? How about $1 million? See, the question was all about assessing risk versus reward. For some people, no amount of money was worth becoming Tyson's personal punching bag, even if it made them instant millionaires. However, I never heard anyone say they would fight Mike Tyson for nothing. I mean, that would just be stupid, right? And yet, in the case of Satan and the fallen angels, they effectively decided to fight Mike Tyson, knowing in advance that not only would they end up drinking meals through a straw, but they'd spend the rest of eternity in prison. Well, eventually. You know, after God allowed them to screw around with the human race for several thousand years first. See, I'm trying to work out the whole cost-benefit analysis of rebelling against Yahweh, but to be honest, I'm just not seeing it. Now, some Christians think they can diffuse this dilemma by suggesting Lucifer's motivations simply weren't rational. The morning star became blinded by his own brilliance and, as a result, succumbed to self-deception. Others say the angels rebelled out of jealousy because they refused to serve dust bunnies made in the image of God. So, since the Bible is unsurprisingly bereft of useful information on the subject, believers have been left to conclude heaven's civil war was the result of self-delusion, envy, or madness. But that raises another question. How can selfish pride or insanity even exist in God's house? One of the reasons Christians look forward to the afterlife is because they believe there will finally be an end to sin and death. But if Lucifer worshipped at the very throne of God and yet still had the capacity for self-deception, then what will keep Christians from making that same mistake? I mean, after 1 billion years have passed in heavenly bliss, could one of the saints accidentally follow in the devil's footsteps and think to themselves, maybe I can be like the Most High? The best answer I've seen from apologists goes something like this. Jesus had free will on earth, but never chose to sin. In the afterlife, Christians shall receive the full measure of Christ's divine nature. Therefore, in heaven, believers will be like Jesus. They'll retain free will, but lose the capacity to sin. Okay, but if it's possible to have free will and never sin, then why didn't God just implant Adam and Eve with Christ's divine nature in the first place? I mean, in that scenario, everybody wins. God gets uncoerced obedience, and mankind doesn't have to suffer. However, Brad Houston from carm.org claims, freedom without rebellion may indeed have been impossible, because it would not be possible for man's freedom to be the same as God's. Well, sure it was possible, if God had allowed Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. After all, God knew his look but don't touch policy was going to be an utter failure from the start, just like he knew all of mankind would end up being like God anyway, knowing good from evil. So in Bible land, it was certainly possible for man's freedom to be the same as God's. However, the only reason it was off limits in the Garden of Eden was because God made it that way. Houston also claims believers will not rebel in heaven because, having experienced both the full effects of sin and the presence of God, they will not turn back to sin. However, Satan and the fallen angels were in that same position, just in reverse order. They began their existence in God's presence, experienced sin, and yet, according to the Bible, they continued in their rebellion against God, despite not having a chance in hell of defeating him. Of course, although Houston admits our world is not the best possible world, take heart, true believers. We do not know fully why God does as he does, but we know God is good. In his wisdom, God sees it best to give man what he wants, without fully knowing the consequences beforehand. I tell you, God's wisdom appears to make even less sense than Mike Tyson. And my friends, beating Tyson in that arena requires an almost Herculean effort.
My style is impetuous. My defense is impregnable. And I'm just ferocious. I want your heart. I want to eat his children. Praise be to Allah.
I sacrificed so much of my life. Can I at least get laid? You know what I mean? I've been robbed of most of my money. Can I at least get a blowjob?